So if you would, wonderful panelists, thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy work week to be with us today. And if you could just tell us a little bit, introduce yourselves, a little bit about your background, the organization you work for, and the work that you guys have been doing. We're just giving them 2 minutes each. We have so much that we want them to cover. Starting with alphabetical order, Alex.
Thanks, Lynn. So my name's Alex Miller. I recently started as the program director for the International Rescue Committee's Asylum Seekers and Families program here in Arizona. We run the Welcome Center in Phoenix, which serves thousands of migrants a month, some being released from detention, some who are crossing the border to seek asylum. I also have the immense luxury of having worked with Chelsea Sacco, a previous colleague at the Florence Project, and I will let her introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Sacco. I am the Equal Justice Works Fellow, sponsored by State Farm, for the Border Action Team of the Florence Project. It says all of that on one small business card. And to echo Alex, we were pretty devastated, but very excited for her new adventures. We worked very closely together over the past year. And so it's really great that we get to continue to work together in these spaces. At the Florence Project and the Border Action Team, our focus is on providing legal education and orientations to asylum seekers and migrants in Nogales, Mexico, with our close partner, the Keno Border Initiative. But due to the unwind of the border, as we have called it, we really were grateful to strengthen our relationships with Casa Alitas and the IRC, in addition to other partners on the ground, in order to come together and create a coalition and truly respond in the Arizona region. And it was thanks in part to Alex's brilliant leadership, as well as Diego, who should be joining us shortly, and other individuals. So we're really happy to be here and to share some of our experiences with you around creative community lawyering.
And just FYI, Diego says his internet is being wonky. Hopefully he will be joining momentarily.
Okay, so we'll go back and introduce him, have him introduce himself when he gets on. Thanks for, that's too bad, but hopefully he'll get on here soon. So here's the question that I'd like to start with is the population that you're working with. Who are the, and obviously, so Diego has the statistics on this. I think though, I know that you guys are also very able to speak, statistics or not, about, you know, the population, the people that you're seeing, and also what are the reasons that people are coming, the people that you've been working with.
So I can speak to this a bit, bridging the gap between legal services and what we saw on the ground in Nogales and the folks that we do see here at the Welcome Center. The Welcome Center has served 23,000 migrants year to date and are seeing consistent growth. September, I think we saw 4,100 individuals. And the demographics are constantly shifting, in part in reaction to US border policies. But beyond folks from Mexico and Central America, we also see a really significant number of individuals from Cuba, from Brazil, from Ecuador, from Venezuela. And in particular here at the Welcome Center, we receive folks who are being released from detention centers, but we're also seeing a significant number of folks who are crossing and actually being permitted to enter the United States through Yuma. And, you know, on any given day, we're seeing around 250 people at the Welcome Center. Chelsea, perhaps you can speak a bit to, you know, what people are here for or why.
Absolutely. And just before I go into that, just to piggyback, at the Keno Border Initiative and really along the Sonoran, Arizona-Sonoran border, we see a huge discrepancy in nationalities. And Alex can attest to this too, and Diego as well. So who I see expelled under Title 42 are predominantly Mexicans and Central Americans, with much more of the majority in recent months being Mexicans. That is in contrast to previously during MPP, when a lot of the Nogales-based population were Cuban, Venezuelan, Nicaraguan. in contrast, the people that the shelters within Arizona see tend to have different nationalities. And I stress this because you may have a border policy that is supposed to be unilateral and uniform, but actually how it's carried out on the ground can be quite disparate along race or nationality lines. I see that Diego's joined us, so I'm going to let him take the floor and introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Diego Pena-Lopez, the program director of Costalitas, and I also work with Save the Children as a senior border specialist there as well. So I think what we're talking about, you were just mentioning, was the volume of guests coming through in languages. And I think to go off of what was just said there from Chelsea, is prehistorically back in, since I've been around with Alitas 2016 to 2019, we were seeing predominantly 60% of our guests consistently being Guatemalan. And now we are seeing predominantly people from Venezuela, Haitians, Cubans, Brazilians, Nicaraguans, where Venezuelans was 628 and Guatemalans is only just 12 of those families that have come through. So it's a significant changes that have occurred because of MPP and Title 42. And predominantly right now, Title 42 in relationship to Mexico.
So earlier, Alex had asked that I explain sort of the reasons that people tend to migrate or to qualify for protection under US law. It can be very different, but I would say that a lot of people are fleeing some level of harm. But as many of us who have worked in this space know, there is different interactions between different drivers and triggers for why people choose to migrate, or excuse me, why people are forced to migrate. And so one of the key things that we make sure to explain in our legal orientations is how exacting what people have to prove or when asylum and an asylum case is. And so the asylum has a really narrow definition. Amongst other things, your harm that you've suffered has to meet or rise to the level that it's considered persecution. It has to have nexus to one of the protected grounds written in the law. And then of course you have to explain things like the government persecutor, or whether it's unwilling or unable. You may have to explain internal relocation. And if you've been displaced for a long time in another country, you also have to be worried about that. Unfortunately, for many of the clients and population we serve, it's really hard to frame the realities of the harm and true dangers they face under this very narrow definition of the way in which asylum is written. And so it's really part of our role at the border to make sure people make informed decisions and understand exactly what they are facing. But as I speak a lot with my partner, sometimes these border policies, as well as our other laws, put people that are facing impossible decisions and ask them to make really tough choices. I think the next section is to focus on the different policies at the border, but I want to give Diego and Alex a moment to jump in and elaborate if any of them have thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's just important to remember that the migrant population we serve is not a monolith, and that everyone has their own story and their own reasons for being here, and that our goal, first and foremost, isn't even really focused on asylum. It's getting people access to the process, which right now is really, really difficult. People are being blocked at the front door when they have a right to seek asylum, and when the United States government is committed in domestic and international law to non-refoulement, or not sending people back to harm. And some of these policies that I think Chelsea is going to explain to you guys are completely at odds with our international and domestic legal obligation. And we continue to send people to harm without having the opportunity to explain to the US government why they deserve protection.
So I'm going to give a brief 10-minute snapshot of some of the various policies and the way that they have interacted at the border over the last 4 to 5 years.
Chelsea, but before you do that, I just, how are we doing on time, Lizzie, with this one? Good.
Sorry, we're good. Yeah, we're right on track.
They're talking so fast that we're right on time. I just wanted to see if Diego wanted to add anything about the types of stories that you hear of in terms of why people are coming.
All right. So I think, the stories it's the gauntlet of situations people are coming from. Oftentimes we don't try to go into the stories so much because they're only with us 12 to 72 hours. But then we have these instances where people are with us for days or weeks because they need the medical attention. Right now, I have just this last week, several people that were crossing through the desert, and two of them became shot. The rest of the people there scattered. And one of them, essentially, the leg was so badly injured that if you see it right now, and when they arrived to us, it flopped, essentially. One woman was shot to the side of her chest, and it was just so close to her heart that, it was miraculous that she didn't pass away from that. What was more miraculous was they were left there in the desert for several days, and essentially an agent went by and saw it and didn't report or say anything, or actually said to them, it's not my job to take care of you, and left them water and left. And we're working with providing them and working with getting some legal services. But we see narratives like that, and then they arrive to us, and one of them tested COVID positive, and we provide the services to them for not only for the medical to address the issues there and the wound care, but also getting them the additional services that they will need when they go to their family and sponsors. And these are adults. I remember when I first started at the shelter, I often reflect on a story of a little boy who was shot 5 times in the back, and immigration, he had no wheelchair, and his cousin carried him across the border, essentially from the southern tip of Mexico, and how he was so used to having to drag himself around the floor. And here I was, a high school teacher, getting off of teaching, and it was my field placement. And I see the little boy like hopping over this ledge, thinking that this cannot be the world that these families live in. And you see those stories coming through of violence, from either the government, from cartels and such, and that narrow gateway that Alex and Chelsea are talking about because of the policies, either from their home countries throughout the journey and then at our US border. But I'll let Chelsea go through and talk about what we're seeing on the border there.
Thanks, Diego. So very briefly, there are often a lot of terms for different policies, and they operate differently, and there are a lot of acronyms. So I'm going to just briefly distinguish each, and I'm going to first do the timeline of how they were rolled out and implemented across the border, and then I'm going to go into the litigation at the federal level around each of the policies. There are a number of different border policies, but I'm going to focus on sort of the 3 that have most affected clients at the Arizona-Mexico border over the past few years. So the first will be metering. The second will be the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as MPP, or the Remain in Mexico program. And the third will be Title 42, which you've already heard some of us mention. So metering began, sort of the first use of metering was seen actually during the Obama administration in 2016, but it really became widespread across the border and implemented in 2017 and 2018. I previously, though I've only been back at the Florence Project for a year, I served as a summer legal intern during the 2018 summer, which is sometimes remembered as the family separation summer. I push back against that because families are always separated at the border under US laws and policies. But metering is essentially where a individual may go up to a port of entry and request asylum, as is their right under the law, and as is the way in which, the legal way in which you are able to start the process. You are also, when you cross a border in between ports of entry, which is known as entering without inspection, if you are encountered by Border Patrol and you request asylum, that is also legally within your rights as an asylum seeker. But metering focuses on for people who are walking up to the port of entry to initiate the asylum process by requesting asylum. What occurs is that Border Patrol will often say, due to lack of capacity to process so many asylum seekers, they turn people away and they'll say, oh, we can only help 2 people a day or 10 people a day. And it's very, in my experience during 2018, when this was really prevalent as well, it was very ad hoc. And I think it's important to stress how this functions in actuality is that the US government, CBP, is not the ones maintaining these lists. They'll tell people, oh, go over there and put your name on a list. Who runs the list? It depends on each region around the border where you're at. In Tijuana, for instance, I believe most of the time it was run by the migrants themselves. And then in other regions, it can be run by local NGOs or local municipalities. In the Nogales area, the list was run very briefly by the Keno Border Initiative, but eventually it went into the municipalities of Nogales, Sonora, running and maintaining the list. And so a family who wants to seek asylum would be turned away from the port, and they'd have to go up and put their name on a wait list and then be displaced for time. Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at one point, the longest up until sort of MPP and Title 42 really hit, you were seeing families was about 10 to 12 weeks, so a couple months.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's important to highlight how the way metering function developed organically and differently from port to port. And in Nogales, for those of you who are local, you may remember a period of time at the DeConcini port of entry where you essentially saw an encampment. You saw people sleeping there as a reaction to people sleeping there to try to ensure that they were able to seek asylum next. These informal lists formed. And, you know, in 2019, the wait was up to about 3 months, right? And this is for folks with insecure housing or none.
Yeah, and so with metering, you would have, as Alex pointed out, homelessness or insecure housing. It exposes people to a lot of other vulnerability around crime and danger and personal safety and health. But that is sort of functionally how metering was. And then whenever their number was up and it was their turn to present, they would be informed, and then they would go to the port that time, months later, from when they first arrived, and present and be processed into the US. Metering lists were often very susceptible to bribery and extortion, to where people would pay money to jump the line and stuff. And obviously particularly vulnerable groups such as like Indigenous speakers or LGBTQ or other folks could be maybe bumped down the list or not paid as much attention to, the resources to bribe or extort their way up to a higher number. And so it was really unjust and unfair in so many different ways in which it was carried out. That is sort of the world of metering. Metering sort of functionally stopped in most places in the Arizona border once Title 42 came into play, which I will explain momentarily. After metering, and running sort of simultaneously and concurrently with it, the Trump administration created a program and a policy called the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, or the Remain in Mexico program. As I just explained, metering, once someone was metered, they'd then be processed into the US eventually and placed in Title 8 removal proceedings, and either detained or at detention centers in the interior, or they'd be paroled and sort of released to carry their case out in their final destination. Under MPP, or the Remain in Mexico program, you would have the same population who had just been metered, but only now when they went for their day to present, they would be processed, but then immediately sent right back to Mexico to wait for the duration of their asylum proceedings and their Title 8 removal proceedings. Tent courts sprung up around different parts of the border. The US government prefers to call these soft-sided courts, but make no mistake, they're absolutely tent courts. and the judges would appear via video conferencing in some of them. There were incredible issues around translation and hearing, and it was just an absolute mess of a program and doesn't resemble anything close to due process. So MPP was carried out across the border in different stages. It started in early January 2019 in like the Calexico, sort of San Diego area, and then it moved to El Paso and other parts of Texas, and finally it came to the Arizona border last. We were like the 9th site in the last sort of port of entry in which people who would be placed in the MPP program. That occurred in about October or November of 2020. However, unlike other ports of entry where they had courts locally at that border point, anyone who was placed in MPP in the Tucson sector in the Nogales area, they had their court dates largely in the El Paso courts. Some of them were in the Tijuana courts. And so this meant that when they did have these ridiculous hearings where they had to show up for their court date, they had to often travel hundreds of miles through cartel territory just to get to their court date. They were often required to show up at 3 or 4 in the morning and wait in very long lines if they had an 8 a.m. court date. And hundreds of people were given the same time to where there was no way the judges could see that many people. And so you often heard stories of people who had traveled in really dangerous circumstances all the way to a court date just to summarily be given a paper saying, thanks, but you're not going to be seen by the judge today. Come back in a month and do this all over again. And then, of course, you had many clients who never made it to court due to the extreme danger that they were in, or the abject poverty they were living in, and all the other issues that could arise from having a large population displaced in Mexico and searching for safety. When Biden came in 2021, he said no new people would be placed in MPP, and then eventually he issued a termination memo, which is being litigated in courts, which I'll explain in a second. But basically, when the pandemic hit, 2 things happened, one with MPP and one with Title 42. With MPP, all the dates were just continued out. And so that population for almost a full year just was technically had a process, but it was completely paused, and they were still staying in this system. Then you had Title 42 enter. Title 42 comes from the Public Health Code in the US, and it is a power of the CDC to prevent the introduction of persons or products that would need to be quarantined, basically. And the Trump administration had been looking for years, actually, for many ways to use this to prevent people entering through the border, asylum seekers or migrants entering through the border, and the pandemic was ultimately what they could sort of hitch their hat onto. And so since the pandemic occurred, anyone who was on a metering list but not yet placed in MPP was subjected to Title 42, as were any new arrivals to the border. And what this means is that it allowed anyone who would cross the border, Border Patrol could quickly expel them back to Mexico. But again, the reason that for the disparate nationalities that we mentioned earlier is that Mexico has agreed to only accept Mexican and Central American expulsions back. And so what this means for other nationalities who may cross the border seeking asylum is that when they are encountered by Border Patrol, they are either placed in detention for long term and then later sent on expulsion flights back, or some may be released into the community where IRC and Casalitas may encounter them. But it's very much disparate on your nationalities. So for instance, we've seen a lot of Brazilians and Ecuadorians placed in detention centers before they're expelled home. Under immigration law, currently, to our knowledge, an expulsion is different from a deportation. A deportation or a removal order carries negative immigration consequences, but a Title 42 expulsion at the moment does not. Those are sort of functionally how they've operated, but to be very clear, Title 42 has been in place for a year and a half, which has meant that nobody has been able to get in and cross for much of that time. But as Alex pointed out, it can be sort of dependent on the region in which you're crossing and your nationality. There was 2 processes by which legal service providers this spring and summer could request from the government that people be exempted from Title 42. Diego, Alex, myself, and many of our coalition members in the Arizona Welcoming Task Force worked tirelessly together for months to help over, I know the Florence Project numbers are about 2,200 people, but there were other partners as well. So I would say maybe an estimate is closer to 2,500 people in the course of 3 to 4 months be exempted from this. And many of those people were people who had been displaced at the border for a year, 6 months or more under Title 42. And many of them were particularly vulnerable families and individuals. In August, however, the Biden administration, did not continue or chose to continue Title 42 rather than end the policy. And to date, there are no clear-cut ways in which people can get exempted from Title 42. We do send Title 42 exemption requests and requests for humanitarian parole, but they are summarily ignored by the local port. And this is something that occurs across the border based off of what our colleagues in other regions tell us. And so the way I would sort of end this is by saying, these are all 3 very important but distinct ways in which both the Trump and the Biden administration have used very restrictionist policies to prevent people from accessing process, accessing due process, and accessing the asylum system. And it leaves them in peril in Mexico for one reason or another. There are federal litigation court cases going on for all 3 of these that would take up a whole other lesson and lecture, but very briefly, for metering right now where it stands is there was a recent decision by the judge that said metering violates the concept of non-refoulement and violates domestic US law over processing of asylum seekers. I think today is when briefing is due by parties on what remedies would look like for people who were metered and how metering would play into Title 42. So things are pending in that case that has, been going on since 2017. In MPP in August, a judge in Texas basically told the Biden administration that the way in which they terminated MPP in June through their termination memo was not in line with the APA, and that they needed to restart the MPP program. There is also another part of the decision that fundamentally misinterprets what the sort of detention authority is for the US government. And the judge suggested basically that if you didn't place people in MPP, then they had to be detained in detention centers. But this is an ongoing case. And at this point, the Biden administration has had to re-engage in negotiations with Mexico to restart the MPP program. They report that they're trying to bring back sort of the infrastructure around these soft-sided courts. And they have also indicated this week that they intend to publish a new termination memo addressing the inadequacies from the Texas court's decision. So all of that is pending. And then finally, a Title 42 case out of the DC Circuit said that Title 42 should not be applied to families, but then just yesterday, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals stayed that order until at least January. And so truly the only power at this point to end Title 42 rests with President Biden and his administration. That is my brief summary of all the ways in which we've been navigating policies, but I'm going to turn it over to Alex briefly.
Chelsea, before you move on, I know we're going to do Q&A at the end, but there's a question in that chat that I think is really relevant. Devin asked whether Title 42 is being used to expel all migrants or only those who are sick, even though it's a public health.
No, all
provision.
Migrants. It doesn't matter. Oh, I have migrants who have been vaccinated, who have proof of COVID test, who have presented with their proof of COVID negativity, and it does not matter. And we've even had local border or CBP officers say it's not really about the pandemic.
I think this pivots us perfectly to kind of the discussion of the reality, the impact on migrants. And I do want to say, Chelsea mentioned the APA, that's the Administrative Procedures Act. And basically it means that if you put something forward without taking certain steps or ticking certain boxes, it can be unwound. So basically the decision to terminate MPP is reversed on a technicality. And I think it's also really important to highlight that the constitutionality of MPP was being litigated, and that case was dismissed as moot, irrelevant. And now we're in a place where we're potentially going to have to re-implement MPP, even though the constitutionality of that policy is dubious. In any event, what are we seeing on the ground? What have these policies resulted in? I think, looking at kind of this confluence of event, basically all three of these policies result in people having to wait for indefinite periods of time. And it has created a new industry for the cartels who have specifically targeted migrants as a result of US policy. And it is incredibly unsafe for migrants who are stuck in the borderlands. And frankly, it's unsafe as humanitarian aid providers who are forced to work as well. In particular, for folks in Title 42 and who are being returned and sorry if I'm breaking up, they're very easily targeted by cartels because they are returned to certain spaces, right? And they are picked off systematically and extorted, kidnapped, raped, and some individuals have even been murdered, right? And the numbers are in the thousands. And when you look at the US's obligation not to return people to harm, it's pretty clear to all of those who work in the borderlands that returning them to the border is in fact returning them to harm. It's also important to revisit something that Diego and Chelsea mentioned in passing, which is that these policies have resulted in disparate outcomes for people that fall largely along nationality and kind of connected racial lines. So for MPP, if you were a Mexican national, you can't be returned back to Mexico because that is the place you are fleeing from harm. But Mexico also wouldn't take people from all nationalities. They would only take folks primarily from Latin America. So you saw Cubans, Venezuelans, and folks from Central America being systematically returned, and a number of other individuals from further afield were processed in and were able to start their proceedings. Title 42, however, is even more insidious because what we've consistently seen is that people from Mexico and from Central America are returned to Mexico. A number of predominantly white Latin Americans processed in and permitted to proceed to move forward with their proceedings, and predominantly Black migrants expelled directly to country of origin. And that's what we saw for Haitians leading up to the decision to grant TPS or temporary protected status. And then in the wake of TPS, that's what we're seeing in Del Rio, right? That the vast majority of Haitians are being gathered up and sent directly back to Haiti despite the humanitarian and climate crisis that is occurring there. Diego, I'll pass it to you.
I think one interesting story to also share with these lateral flights are people being sent back early in the pandemic. I believe it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alex and Chelsea, I think 3 weeks in, Guatemala was saying we can't accept these families back to our home country because it was sending COVID back. So our policies under Title 42 was leading to an increased rate of spread for COVID in Central America, in these countries. And it resulted to people being sent back to Mexico and really unlivable situations for people in Mexico, and risking many, and for sure, many people's lives lost because of it and will never be identified and known. So I think then, are we going to the next section?
So, Diego, I know that you had also been meaning, we had wanted you to talk about what you'd seen about how the policies played out on the ground. You had mentioned to me with in terms of medications being confiscated and just people not understanding their next steps.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of those things have been going on since the beginning of me being at Alita. So I know far before I arrived, when we were starting at the bus station, first with medications taken away. So when families are arriving, some of them have heart medications just for high blood pressure, diabetes medications. And when they go through immigration, they sometimes give them a medication for US equivalent, sometimes they don't. And a lot of those sometimes is either that they're trying to go too fast or they're just not asking the questions. And also recognizing the language issues or challenges that those families have. I've had instances where people have no seizure medication or cancer medication, that those medications were taken away and no thought or attempt was used to get them those additional medications. That person that came out of the hospital, or the two people that came out of the hospital with gunshot wounds, did not come out with medication. One person came out with Tylenol as this prescription for it. I mean, let's just take a step back and think about with those things. Back when I was at Alita, before Title 42 and MPP, when I was saying that we were seeing many people from Guatemala, about 60% of those people, 20% of that population spoke indigenous languages, Mam, Quiche, so forth. Really no attempts at all were made for those families to understand their legal statuses. Even for those that speak Spanish, many of them think that they actually have asylum and are not fully aware of the next steps and how many months, years it's going to take, and the cost that it will have, and the challenges for their sponsor families for them to stay with, and so forth. And then to follow through with that, there was one more big point with that one I was going to say. I think with the separation of families, like right now we've seen about one fifth of our families are separated this last month. Over 400 and some families have been separated. And that has a lot to do with the lateral flights from Del Rio, as well as us receiving families from Yuma. And what those things happen is either those family members go to other portions of the border from other lateral flights, or stay in Del Rio, and stay in Yuma, go to Phoenix or Mecca if they're coming from the Yuma entry. And we have WhatsApp groups that shelters and other organizations are talking to each other, saying, like, where is this person? Can we identify? And for us as people providing humanitarian services on the ground, we're sitting there and we're like, we aren't sure where your family member is. They could have been sent back to Mexico. They could be at one of these shelters. They could be in detention. And it just shows how broken down that system is. And one more thing to add there is what Alex said earlier about the inequalities based off of countries that they're coming from and so forth. We see that when you're looking at it. Certain populations have more of an effect on that. So I'll stop there.
I'll jump in really briefly. I think truly the human cost cannot be understated. But the intersection between the human cost and the impracticality of Title 42 is also really critical. Title 42 is supposedly justified by public health because of the pandemic, a measure to protect the US interior from the spread of COVID-19. And because CBP and Border Patrol supposedly do not have the capacity to safely process individuals. But what we've seen for 18 months is CBP and Border Patrol officials sitting on their thumbs, maskless, right? And we know that, the billions of dollars of commerce that crosses the border every year has not stopped. That spring break Mexico was not canceled. Right, like we were able to freely cross the border for the entire 18 months. So it feels like Title 42 surgically targeted asylum seekers. And it also led to worse public health outcomes, both in countries of origin, like Diego pointed out, but also at the border, where towns did not have the infrastructure, public health, or otherwise to support migrant communities being rapidly expelled by the United States. I also kind of want to highlight the hypocrisy, because we consistently saw individuals, pregnant women in particular, who ended up in Tucson hospitals, who would have, as a matter of routine, been tested for COVID, kind of like the person in the chat had asked, and were still returned to the border despite high-risk pregnancy, despite being COVID negative. And in one of these instances, this almost resulted in a fatality. of a woman who we tried to intervene on her behalf before she was expelled. She was returned to Nogales with no support at 38 weeks pregnant and went into labor a couple days later. The child was underweight and after they crossed again was rushed to the NICU. And Diego can confirm, but like hours away from a potential fatality. And that could have been avoided 5 days before, I was interacting with Border Patrol, trying to ensure she wouldn't be removed because of the risks. But the answer was no.
Chelsea, that's your hand up for now, right?
Yeah.
I just saw it. So, and I just want to say, so I'm going to let Chelsea jump in where you need to, but I also want to say that we want to make sure there's plenty of room for you guys to talk about all your responses and all the amazing work that you've been doing to respond to these challenges.
Yeah, so I really echo everything Diego and Alex said, and they've covered most of it, but I just want to highlight and stress two things really quick. And then I see we have questions in the chat, but I think at this point we can elaborate on them in the question and answer period. One is that Alex pointed out that it's sort of, there's this high cost to human life, and it just sort of what was your phrase, Alex? I interpret it as like just irrational public policy. But it goes to that, but you can really truly see it as well with lateral flights. I mean, the cost of moving people from one part of a border, which is quote unquote saturated with asylum seekers, to expel them through another part of the border or expel them even further to Mexico or their country of origin, costs an incredible amount of money in flights and personnel and resources that is far less than if you just processed them through ports of entry. And I want to clarify, this goes to one question in the chat. Any COVID testing that migrants and asylum seekers have done in order to be exempted from Title 42 was not from the US government. Local humanitarian and or legal service providers around the border had to coordinate COVID testing and or quarantine space for their own population that they're serving. So there's these policies that are expected to be enacted, but that look towards NGOs on the ground to carry out the day-to-day part of it. And this leads into issues around transparency and accountability, because when our team has to be the message and the mouthpiece and the face telling someone this is why the border is closed, and for a short period of time access to me meant you had access to process, and then it's suddenly taken away, and I am once again still the mouthpiece and the face in delivering that message, it fundamentally erodes trust that has to be built and trust that has to be earned between us and the populations that we serve. It can erode trust with different community partners if you're not careful and diligent. And yet there's quickly shifting policies that can change overnight. We literally had Friday morning news that we had to COVID test everyone who had to present at the port the following Monday. And do you know how hard it is to find COVID tests for 30 people on a Saturday in a random Mexican town? So we're
try 180 people, 180 people over a week that we had to last minute find testing for, when there was readily available testing immediately on the other side of the border that Casalitas would have provided, along with the potential to quarantine in safety. Because the other question is, if those individuals are positive, what do you do? And the answer is force them to quarantine or shelter in place. When you're homeless, that's hard. In Mexico, where they're already being targeted by cartels, right? Like, wouldn't we rather have them quarantine in safety?
Yes, absolutely. And we're about to get into I think we're leading into the part, which is the next session, of how did we respond? But the last thing I want to point out from what Alex just said about shelter space is, while there are very good, trustworthy shelters in parts of Mexico, it is not uncommon for shelter directors and shelter spaces to be the perpetrators of harm on migrants as well. We've heard plenty of cases of widespread extortion, where people have to pay for spoiled meals and food, not poisoned, spoiled. And then we've heard cases where, shelter directors let armed men into the shelter. We've heard cases where shelter directors call Mexican immigration on non-Mexican asylum seekers. We've had, unfortunately, cases where shelter directors sexually violate migrants who are staying in their shelters. And so these are also unsafe places. And these are some of the impossible choices I mentioned before that migrants face daily at being displaced at the border.
We had shelter directors charge migrants thousands of dollars to access to our phone number that was readily available.
Without our knowledge.
Without
I think
our
is the key
Yeah.
point. And we took steps immediately upon finding that out. But I think we should go into how we respond to these
Or
things.
I think we actually have to go into question and answer.
No, we're good. We've got like 10 minutes. It ends at 1:15, I think, formally. So
Yeah, absolutely. You guys
I
have
missed that
time.
part, Leslie.
We wanted you to talk about how you respond to the challenges, and then the next thing we wanted to talk about was what you think the country can and should do, reform proposals. So we have 10 minutes for all of that, which is not a lot, but let's get on it.
Okay, so first I would like to say is we've all of us here on this team with Florence Project, oh my gosh, the IRC and Costalitas. It took me a second, Alex. I'm sorry. It's all
I know,
new
because you
stuff.
associate me with the Florence Project. It's fine.
No, but I think we're all part of this task force working together with other groups across the border to talk about and address how do we talk to the administration? How do we talk to our local DHS officials between all branches there? How do we work with our county and our city folks on things? So that's the first, one of the great groups that have come up right now. But we also have smaller groups working all in rural communities. We have we're seeing people being dropped off and processed in Ajo, about 2.5 hours away from Tucson. So working with those groups, the city there, or it's not even a city actually, it's unincorporated. So the population there on figuring out how do we get resources to them. And then I know, we worked on trying, and major shout outs to Alex and Chelsea as well, because they worked out throughout the weekend to try to figure out how to get those 180 people, those testing kits across the border to Mexico for that week. But I think that's a key thing, is having those collaborations, conversations with other NGOs and other groups providing services to the same population, and trying to address all the different needs and how things change so quickly, especially when we're looking at these policies. Yeah, it was just that weekend. It felt, okay, it was like months. Okay, it was weeks, but nevertheless. Anyways, then the other thing I wanted to mention too is, reaching out to volunteers and groups and seeing how to get people active into these conversations. Because it's so easy for us to just sit here and no offense to anybody, but to sit and look at, what's going on and then just turn the channel and not really think about how do you get people involved and participating and really looking at how to change the system and to be active to address, we saw a week ago, people from Haiti being chased down by Border Patrol agents on horseback. And we don't live in the Wild West. It's crazy, but we have to get people, okay, well, you know what I mean there, but we have to get people active and trying to see and take up an action step in all of that and building those collaborations from the grassroots to different levels.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think, to be honest, I've said this to Alex privately, and I may have said it publicly. One of the most meaningful parts of the last year of my life has been to be able to do really creative community strategic coalition building alongside Alex, Diego, Beth, Teresa, Noah, and countless other people to respond and rise up to meet what is being asked of us. And in order to best serve our clients. And it's been incredibly special. So I can give an example of one way in which we've done that. We've alluded to some, but so in anticipation of the border unwind, Alex reached out to many community partners around the Arizona region, both the smaller volunteer groups that Diego mentioned, as well as IRC Solitas. And we were able to, over the course of many months, develop an infrastructure to receive in a dignified, safe, and welcoming way asylum seekers. So whether it was in either exemption process that existed in the spring and summer, how it worked is that we as legal service providers would work with people around the state of Sonora, Mexico, and we would refer them to the US government through whatever the process was for that particular process, because there were two with certain distinctions. But once they were approved and we received notice that they were approved, we had to coordinate COVID testing on the Mexico side once that became a requirement. If there was quarantine, if there was a need for quarantine, there would have to be a quarantine space coordinated by humanitarian partners. And then we accompanied either from legal service providers or humanitarian providers in Mexico. Every day at the port, we accompanied people to walk them up and make sure we had eyes on the process to make sure they Diego, so Casalitas, IRC, the Florence Project, Justice for Our Neighbors, and other organizations actually got together and wrote a grant in order to have funds to have a reception center right outside the Nogales port of entry. Because previously we were told that, you know, there was no way that Border Patrol and CBP could bring people, transport, thank you, there we go, English, could transport people up to Tucson if they were no longer in their custody, unless they were going to refer everyone uniformly to ICE. And we didn't necessarily want that, because then that's just, there's a better way to receive people and welcome them with dignity. So we were able to obtain funds in order to have a reception center, and we worked with local county governments as well to arrange transportation, where Casalitas then met them, provided safe shelter space, provided COVID testing if they hadn't already been testing on the Mexico side, quarantine space as well, other medical services. Diego could go into it more, and then they went on to their final destinations. But this took an incredible, I mean, we've probably sent 25 emails a day for months to each other some days, just doing strategic overall coordination and working on individual client cases to really accompany these families into the US. And now that those processes have been done, we continue to do strategic coalition around advocacy to inform people, because we're not in every space in the border, and we need to know what issues are arising in other parts in order to respond and advocate against them.
So I think it's important to reflect on a lot of organic coalition building and community inspired work that goes back decades in Tucson in particular, and all across the border. People who have worked really hard for a very long time to try to create systems of accountability and to provide welcome for migrants, whether that's the sanctuary movement or groups like No Mas Muertes or others, Transqueer Pueblo, Casa Mariposa, folks that have worked really, really hard to do this work. And I think, you know, Casalitas and the IRC Welcome Center were born of that community collaboration and coordination. And I think, you know, the work that all of us do depends on community support, but it's also this balance of reacting and kind of doing triage work, and then trying to think forward and trying to think strategically about how to get out around some of these obstacles that we in the community we serve confront. And I know, you know, moving into Q&A soon, but the last thing is kind of what our collective vision is for what a more just immigration system would look like. And I think in the darkness we're in right now, it's really hard for a lot of us to have this vision. But I think there are a few kind of, I don't want to say easy things to do, because I think it would be really expensive, but it's the right thing to do. But, you know, we should be providing welcome and not incarcerating people. Incarceration is really, really expensive. Immigration proceedings should be judged by an independent arbiter, not an arm of the executive that has a vested interest in saying no. externalization of the asylum process through policies like MPP and Title 42 in metering need to be wiped out, and it probably needs to be legislated, because otherwise folks will come up with creative ways when convenient to exploit and push migrants away. We've seen migrants scapegoated all throughout US history. I think also we need to invest in the community and invest in those groups that are interested in providing welcome. And that welcome needs to be completely divorced from any sort of carceral or detained based process. And we're starting to see things pop up where kind of ICE, working in partnership with a so-called nonprofit, continues a detention model that's being proffered as reception. And we really hope that that is not the future, and that instead the government can invest in organizations like us that have decades of learning and that have worked so hard to build community ties and to work with the migrant population.
You've addressed a lot of things, and I'm interested in hearing also from Chelsea and Diego on if you have more thoughts about how we can move things in a totally different direction.
I have plenty of thoughts, but I think Alex covered a lot of them in sort of broad strokes. I think the thing that I will add is part of whatever reforms happen have to be from listening to the population that you're serving, right? I think in immigration law, not only do we have this really enforcement-minded mentality, but there's definitely a top-down approach that misunderstands a lot of what people are fleeing, a lot of the situations that our laws and policies put people in. And I don't mean just from these restrictionist border policies, I also mean from all the procedural rules around a court case within the US as well. Because there are very high stakes. If you miss your court hearing, you're automatically entered in an absentia removal order, right? Which dramatically increases, or it's really hard and complicates all the rest of your immigration proceedings. So my basic point is I think that we need to have some level of listening to the different communities that are affected by our policies to understand how to reform them better. We are really blessed with the Florence Project to work so closely with the Keno Border Initiative, who has a migrant organizing committee. It is self-organized by migrants who are currently in Nogales demanding an end to Title 42 by affirmatively going up to the port every day and asking for asylum peacefully to bring attention to the fact that no processing exists. And every day, anytime someone presents, the port shuts down all port operations, which feels incredibly extreme. So I think part of it is listening to the communities we serve. They have an incredibly rich history and traditions and roots and in a lot of things, and they understand sort of generational strengths as well as generational trauma. And I think that there's a lot that can be learned when we're talking about reforming the immigration system beyond just asylum. We have to be listening to the populations that are a part of it.
And I think the only thing, I mean, how do I follow Alex and Chelsea with those answers? That was my worry the other day, actually. I think with that one too is, when we're listening and everything, is recognizing every step of that journey that people are coming from, what is going on in their home countries? What is our role in the United States for causing a lot of the trauma and the stresses in those home countries and putting certain leadership there and leading to the challenges that these families are facing? The journey across Central America, as they were talking about many of the shelters and such, and the lack of funding resources and putting people in further risk throughout that journey through Mexico. I mean, it's just bewildering to me. I'm just gonna side rant. Bewildering to me that the rest of the we can go party it up in Cancun and such, do all these things in Mexico, but just right across the border, people are afraid to travel in the streets. And it's just bewildering that we don't talk about that. And that's our next door neighbor to the south for this country. And that's just missed for so much of this country. And then, so those two first, and then within, putting people in those detention centers or processing spaces, as Alex saying, having NGOs part of it. It's so humbling and sad at the same time to see all these people from Afghanistan coming through these last few weeks, and then seeing NGOs being able to work in these military bases or these spaces, but we're never allowed to work in the past of those spaces. And I think Alex actually mentioned something like this yesterday. Why can't we have legal groups like the Florence Project there? Why can't we have groups like Castalitas having representatives there? I don't get a roster of who's coming to the shelter and have to create that when they arrive. But we're able to be so much more effective if we had some of those resources there. And then throughout their journey in the US, I've had people being with, you have to hold businesses and organizations accountable too, either for working as well as to transport. So people coming from leaving Tucson to say Florida, where about 40% of the families go right now. I've seen people stranded in Texas for several days, never being given money or resources that they would give somebody that looked a little different than them or knew English, get those opportunities. And then once they get to their destinations, the ability to get access to food banks and resources. There is no resources for them. And the mere fact to get a worker's visa, it takes like an obscene amount of time and an obscene amount of money for someone that's not allowed to work or anything. And I think we have to look at each one and evaluate and work with those families and those people, similar to what the Florence Project is to recognize how do we make it ever so much better? And there's just so many different levels. But I'll stop there because we got Q&A now, right?
We do have Q&A. I'm going to jump in with moderator prerogative here, and as a person who's taught refugee law for 20 or something years, is to say that as Chelsea mentioned, the asylum law, who's actually allowed in once you can get access to all this process, is so narrow, both in the way it's written and as it's interpreted. And more people are coming from untenable situations where they're going to be sent back to die, but they won't fit within the asylum laws. This includes people, there's climate change refugees, but also people who are facing a lot of other violence that can't be fit within, that's not because of their race, religion, etc., recognized categories. And the asylum laws that we have are based on immediate post-World War II United Nations definitions. So it's not going to be easy to tackle that, but the definition, in my opinion, needs to really at least focus on the level of harm and danger that a person's facing, and not just the reasons why. So I'm going to be quiet now, and thank you so much for this excellent presentation. Let's go on to some questions.
Thank you, and thank you all for sharing all of that. I'm just going to take the questions in the order that they came into the chat, and if there's no more, I will shamelessly ask more questions. So please feel free to continue sending them my way. The first one is from Claude, and he asks, what could happen if the United States has deported non-Haitian nationals from the United States to Haiti? And I guess built into that is when and under what circumstances we can remove people to countries that are not their country of origin.
I can start with this. In general, if someone is in the United States, has gone through immigration proceedings and is ordered removed, they will only be removed to a third country if their country of origin will not accept them, and that country will. As a general principle, folks aren't or shouldn't be randomly sent to third countries. That said, with Title 42 and MPP and the current policy context, and there were a number of other policies, these asylum cooperative agreements that essentially permitted the United States to return migrants to third countries to seek asylum there. I don't know if you're trying to highlight a specific circumstance of folks returned to Haiti that were not Haitian. But for the most part, where we see people return to third countries, they either have citizenship or residence there, or we're talking about Mexico, where the United States, or Guatemala or El Salvador, where the United States has agreements with those countries to accept and take those individuals.
Thanks, Alex. And Claude, feel free to send a follow-up too if you have any follow-up questions to that. The next question is about family separation, which I think a couple of you mentioned. So the specific question is what family members are separated, for example, husband and wife pairs or siblings, and I guess under what circumstances, what I would add, do you see that?
I can start off answering it from like what I prepare clients to be separated for, just purely under immigration laws and some anecdotal stories. But then I think Diego and Alex, maybe they can talk in the interior because, you know, they'll see it from that angle. The way in which a family is defined under US immigration law is pretty narrow. So it's pretty much a parent with their minor children. So if we see siblings, like older siblings traveling with younger siblings, I have to explain the unaccompanied minor process to prepare them for the fact that the older sibling is going to be separated because the minor child who's not traveling with their parent or guardian is going to be treated as an unaccompanied minor and placed in a completely separate process. That is one way in which family separation occurs. It also occurs, we know, if we look at the history of migration, there are plenty and just cultural traditional differences of definitions of families. There are many families where maybe a child is growing up with an auntie, an uncle, and a grandparent, and they spent most of their childhood with that person, and they're traveling to the border, and for all intents and purposes, that is their caretaker, but it's not their legal guardian. Under US law, that child will also be placed as an unaccompanied minor and separated from their loved ones and the only family they may know. Adult children. So if you have a 19-year-old, 20-year-old traveling with mom, dad, and younger siblings, I also have to prepare them that they will very likely be treated as a single adult. And depending on the policies at the time, they may be tagged as a priority for detention. And they will be sent off to a detention center while the rest of their family is released. Other examples of where it comes up is when you have an unmarried couple. There are different types of marriages recognized by different cultures and traditions, but if you don't have a legal document proving that you are married under sort of your country's civil laws, then you could be separated from your spouse and your children. We see family separation occur if someone has prior immigration history or prior criminal history. They're at an increased risk of detention, and therefore they could be separated. Those are sort of the main ways in which when I see families of different makeups, I flag for them, hey, there's this increased risk of family separation just purely on the ways in which US immigration laws, policies, and priorities for detention operate. Then there are cases where under Title 42, we've heard of families crossing and like parents getting separated from their kids because maybe their kids were farther away in the desert and the parent was suffering, you know, from the elements or something like that. And their kid was treated as an unaccompanied minor, and the Border Patrol refuses to put them back together with their kid and reunite them. We've heard situations of spouses where a partner or a spouse, especially if they're pregnant, will be sent either into CBP custody or a hospital, and their partner or spouse who they're traveling with is sent either to detention or to Casalitas or the shelters. So there's sometimes where medical cases may occur in the borderlands and how Border Patrol processes them into the US where families can get separated. And I think that's a really great place for Alex and Diego to pick up.
And I think Diego can talk to this at greater length, but we routinely see spouses separated, and in particular from certain countries. So at the Welcome Center, every single Iranian couple has been separated, where one of the partners has been sent to detention and the other one has been released to the Welcome Center. And we think this is because they're getting flagged as security risks profiled. Lynn asked an important question about Title 42 kind of creating as an after effect family separation, and that is absolutely true. In desperation, folks who had been waiting for months, if not years at the border, knowing that Title 42 cannot be applied to unaccompanied children, making a terribly difficult decision to send their kids ahead. And we've basically seen that all along the application of Title 42 at the border, that yes, some parents are deciding that it is so unsafe in Mexico that they would rather send their kids ahead as unaccompanied children. Diego,
And just a final point on that, when they send them ahead, it's not like they say, okay, go cross right here. I mean, they could, but often what we hear of is where they're sending their kids with coyotes who are maybe have ties to organized crime, or organized crime actively approaching families and saying, hey, I'll cross your kids. So there are very real security risks beyond just the risk of crossing a border.
And to add to the separation of families, one other group that we often see is pregnant women and their husbands being separated. And it's just so bewildering to me. You know, you see this law in Texas, you know, going on, but we don't recognize a pregnant woman and her husband as a family crossing the border. It's the only time we won't want to recognize it. And it's just bewildering to see that happen. And I want to also add, with those situations, oftentimes the sponsor, the family member that they're going to, is that husband's family member. So for that woman, it's a difficult and horrendous choice at times that they've never met that family member. And then we're asking them to consider going to them. And that's what they're expected to go to their court hearings and live the rest of several years possibly without seeing their husband. And it's just so, I can't, there's no words for that. And I'm going to go ahead and leave that. But I actually, with the unaccompanied minors, the one thing I would like to add to it is the longer as we see these policies, we saw a huge bump when the Biden administration first came in of unaccompanied minors coming through. And now, because we keep on adding time, we're starting to see that number start rising again out of accompanied minors. And I think that's something we should all be reflecting on and pushing to see these changes going through as we're talking about here.
So I want to make sure we end on time. It is 1:15, and all the people who need to leave or want to leave should leave. And do the panelists, are any of you able to stay on a little bit if there are more questions? We don't want to hold you hostage.
I can stay very briefly, maybe 5 minutes, perhaps wrap up with, I think there was one last question in the chat.
So I think it's awesome for those who can stay and want to keep going for a little bit, and those who have to leave should leave. And I want to just, those of you who want to unmute and give a round of applause to this amazing panel. Give you a few seconds to do that, and let's do it. Thank you so much. You're just an amazing panel. You guided yourselves seamlessly, and you taught us an amazing amount of very short period of time. Thank you for that, and thank you for all the hard work that you're doing.
Thanks, Lynn. Alex, before you go, I'd be curious your response on this. One of the questions was, what are the concrete ways in which you're engaging migrants and their voices in the work you're doing? I don't know if you or Diego want to chat about that.
So I think this is a really critical question. I think historically, the humanitarian model really is based on kind of a colonial kind of savior philanthropy model, which is can be really detrimental to the communities that we're trying to serve, and making sure that those communities have a voice in the direction we take and the types of services we provide is really important. I think the Keno Border Initiative, frankly, does a better job than any of the rest of our organizations at incorporating the voice of migrants into the work they do. But I think all of us here are committed to trying to raise those voices and to also figure out ways to better integrate the grassroots organizations that are migrant and community led into the work we do, and to see them as true partners. But it is a work in progress, and it's somewhere where, frankly, any nonprofit has to think critically about the systems of persecution that they incidentally perpetuate and sustain even through their work, and trying to support and help people in need.
There's another half to that question that I also want to address. Maybe Diego, this would be best directed to you. But Kate also asked what you recommend in terms of contacting people to volunteer who are interested in assisting with the situation at the border, whether it's helping find COVID-19 testing to translation, interpretation, and everything in between.
I think reaching out to the organizations and seeing and sharing your skill set and what you'd be interested and willing to do is huge. I will tell you, I am not turning away volunteers right now. because the need is, so large for us at the moment. But that need, because of these policies, quickly changes, and we have highs and lows. And I think being patient particularly for me, being patient as we have to really adjust and pivot to what we're seeing on the border and working together on it. I mean, Alita started off with volunteers or just people working at the bus station and recognizing a need. And it was 1 to 3 days on average we see people. But I think it's working in that way of we're all in it together, and these policies keep on changing and are so dynamic. But just reaching out and offering to help is a huge thing to these groups.
Alex, sorry, go.
Oh,
You go
so
first.
I think IRC, the Welcome Center, and Casalitas are much more flexible in the types of volunteering they can accept, because you don't have to be a lawyer or necessarily speak Spanish, right? You can work in the ropa room and like organize clothing by size and, put together meal packets and stuff where, it really is just spending that time. Your credentials aren't as important. That is different from a legal services perspective, though we try to get creative about ways to put people to work as well. But I echo what Diego says. IRC's Welcome Center has a volunteer coordinator. I will send information to Lizzie and Lynn. Of course, we're up in Phoenix, so I imagine some of you may be up here as well. We're working and thinking strategically about how to expand services to the border and work in partnership with Casalitas and the Florence Project and that new reception center down there. So really, we welcome any interest and, again, thank the community for continuing to show up.
Yeah, I will echo what Diego and Alex said. Part of my Equal Justice Works project is to have a volunteer program at the border, and at every change, Alex bore witness to this, at every change, her and I was like, okay, now that we have figured out what's left and what's right and what's up and what's down with this new reality we're in, let's incorporate volunteers. And it was as if as soon as the words escaped from my mouth, the government was like, here's a whole new process for you to like get accustomed to. And so it's as to what Diego was saying of like patience, it's not from someone on this side of it. It's not that I don't want to have volunteers and create those opportunities, but we have to sometimes first pivot ourselves and just learn what the new reality is before I can train anyone else in that reality. And if our reality is shifting as quickly as it has over these past 9 months, it is sometimes very hard to onboard volunteers in that way in space. And then, of course, as Alex pointed out, unfortunately, I have to have people who speak Spanish minimally. And Kino, even though they are more sort of at shelters and like IRC and Casalitas, they do also, I think in general, prefer Spanish speakers as well, because they need you to be able to speak and interact with the clients that you're serving. So I want to just, and you can always reach out and I will always look for ways to plug you in if I have something available. But I want to highlight an opportunity beyond the ones Alex and Diego pointed out that actually I think is missed a lot in the conversation. People don't know what's going on at the border. And so one of the ways in which you could almost best volunteer for us is by not only helping increase donations to like the IRC and Casalitas, whether that's financial donations, so they have the funds to buy the COVID tests or to do whatever they need to do on the ground, but also that they have clothing donations or food donations or whatever it may be. And their websites will have more information and their volunteer coordination will have that. But I also think it's important of like imagining your volunteer role as a publicity arm, because we're in these spaces and we're trying to like get the word out and advocate and lift up migrant voices as well. But there's just not always that reach beyond whoever we're connected to. And so one of the ways in which people could actually be a huge help is having, Diego and I have talked about this before in the off chance, but like task force that anytime we're trying to get this messaging out, you are really great with social media and within the local community organizing spaces and stuff, and you spread the message there and sort of expanding that microphone and that reach of this information, because as you can see, people just don't know what's going on, and it's for good reason. It changes all the time and we live busy lives. So I think a lot of people don't think of that as volunteering, but if that could be a huge way to actually help, and to, especially if the voices that you're trying to elevate are the ones from the migrants themselves. Like this week, we've really been trying to elevate what the migrants in Nogales have been doing. And it made Arizona news, but hasn't made national news, right? Doing solidarity marches and organizing that is another way to think of volunteering as well.
On that front, I want to put one last plug. I think, and as much as like social media, whatever, following some of our social media from the organizations will also clue you into opportunities. And when we're asking people to do call-ins and other types of more like organizing action, which is something short of volunteering, but also a way to get involved in the migrant justice movement.
I don't think we have any more questions. Professor Marcus, I don't know if you had any like closing wrap ups.
My only closing wrap up is that you guys have packed so much information and emotion and conviction into one panel, and I don't know how to properly express my appreciation, but probably with like the heart that Yvonne put up there a minute ago. Thank you guys so much.
This was really great. Thank you so much.